Between 1953 and 1954, the United States Army secretly sprayed toxic chemical particles over the homes of roughly 10,000 people in St. Louis, Missouri, and those people had absolutely no idea it was happening. The families living in the Pruitt-Ego housing projects went about their days. Children played on the sidewalks, mothers hung laundry out of windows, elderly residents sat on stoops in the summer heat. None of them knew that military aircraft were passing overhead, deliberately releasing clouds of zinc cadmium sulfide particles into the air above their homes. That classified program was called Operation LAC, Large Area Coverage, and for nearly 40 years the government told no one. What makes this story unlike almost any other government cover-up in American history is not just that it happened. It is what the declassified documents reveal about who was chosen, why they were chosen, and what the Army actually knew about what it was releasing into the air that those families breathed every single day. The records are now public. The test reports exist. The targeting criteria is documented. And what those documents say is something the government spent decades hoping you would never read. To understand what was done to the residents of St. Louis, you need to understand the Cold War fear that made it feel justified inside the Pentagon in the early 1950s. The Soviet Union had developed biological weapons capabilities that genuinely terrified American military planners. The strategic nightmare scenario was this: a Soviet aircraft or even a converted cargo ship could release biological agents, anthrax, plague, botulinum toxin, over a major American city. Millions could die before anyone understood what had happened. The Army's Chemical Corps, the division responsible for chemical and biological warfare, needed to answer a specific question. If an enemy released a biological agent over an American city, how far would it travel? How would wind patterns, building density, temperature inversions, and street layouts affect dispersal? Where would the particles ultimately land? Who would be exposed, and at what concentration? The only way to answer those questions with real data was to conduct actual open-air tests over actual cities. And here is where the decision-making process becomes deeply troubling. The Army did not choose to test over empty desert. They did not choose unpopulated rural areas. The entire scientific premise of Operation LAC required testing over real urban environments, real streets, real buildings, real weather patterns, and real human populations, because only real conditions would generate the data they needed. So the question became not whether to expose civilians, but which civilians, and the documents show exactly how that decision was made. The Army identified what they called vulnerability zones, specific urban neighborhoods chosen for their demographic and geographic characteristics. The criteria listed in the planning documents included high population density, minimal public awareness risk, low likelihood of media attention, and close proximity to major transportation corridors. When you overlay those criteria onto the city of St. Louis, the result is not random. The areas selected were almost exclusively low-income black neighborhoods on the city's north side. Pruitt-Igoe, which would later become one of the most infamous housing projects in American history, was at the time of the tests newly constructed. It was a dense, contained residential environment with limited public visibility, low political influence, and a predominantly black tenant population. The Army knew exactly who lived there. They simply decided those lives were acceptable test subjects. The Army described zinc cadmium sulfide to any official who asked as a harmless fluorescent powder. The official position, held for decades and repeated in congressional testimony, was that ZNCDS, as it was abbreviated in the documents, posed no meaningful health risk to exposed populations. That was not entirely true, and internal documents suggest the Army understood that at the time. Here is what the Army knew in 1952 about cadmium. Pure cadmium, the cadmium component in zinc cadmium sulfide, is a heavy metal classified today by the International Agency for Research on Cancer as a Group 1 carcinogen. That means there is sufficient evidence in humans that cadmium causes cancer. In 1952, the full carcinogenic profile of cadmium was not yet established with the certainty we have today, but the Army's own safety assessors knew enough to flag it. Internal memos from the chemical course describe respiratory concerns associated with cadmium compound inhalation and note that prolonged or repeated exposure may produce chronic effects. They flagged it, they noted the risk, and then they sprayed it over a housing project full of children anyway. The particles were sized specifically for maximum atmospheric suspension. The Army needed them to stay airborne and travel as far as possible to generate useful dispersal data. This meant the particle size was engineered to be small enough to be inhaled deeply into the lungs, 1 to 5 microns. That is the respirable range, the size category that allows particles to bypass the upper respiratory system and penetrate directly into the alveoli of the lungs, where they can enter the bloodstream and accumulate in organ tissue. The Army deliberately engineered their test particles to be maximally inhalable. Then they released them over a neighborhood where thousands of people, including children with developing respiratory systems, were living and breathing outdoors. The spray operations were conducted from aircraft and from ground-level blowers mounted on cars and rooftops. The ground operations were designed to maximize exposure within the housing project perimeter itself. Operatives drove through the streets of Pruitt-Ego, releasing the chemical mixture from vehicles, while residents went about their daily lives. St. Louis was not the only city tested. Operation LAC ultimately covered a corridor stretching from the Midwest to Canada, with tests conducted over Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Winnipeg, Manitoba as well. But the intensity of the St. Louis operations, the number of spray events, and the proximity to dense residential areas was concentrated in ways that the other sites were not. 28 separate spray operations over St. Louis, 9 over Minneapolis, 7 over Winnipeg. And when researchers began analyzing those numbers alongside demographic data in the 1990s, a pattern emerged that the Army has never fully explained. The St. Louis spray zones, where the concentration of operations was highest, overlapped almost perfectly with the city's highest density black neighborhoods. The areas receiving the lowest concentration of spray operations in Minneapolis were its wealthier, predominantly white neighborhoods. This is not a conspiracy theory derived from inference. This is data drawn directly from the Army's own operational logs, cross-referenced against census records. The pattern is documented. The Army has acknowledged the operations. What they have never provided is a satisfactory explanation for why the targeting distribution looks the way it does. In 1994, when Congress held hearings on Operation LAC and related programs, Army representatives were asked directly about the demographic composition of the test populations. Their answer was that test sites were selected based on meteorological and urban structural characteristics, not population demographics. But the meteorological and structural characteristics of North St. Louis are not meaningfully different from other areas of the city that were not targeted. The wind patterns are the same. The building heights are comparable. The street grid is similar. The variable that is different is who lived there. Lisa Martino Taylor, a sociologist at St. Louis Community College, spent over a decade compiling and analyzing the declassified Operation LAC documents. Her 2012 dissertation, later published as a book, concluded that the testing program represented a case of environmental racism conducted under military cover, and that the targeting criteria, while never explicitly documented in racial terms, produced outcomes consistent with deliberate selection of politically vulnerable minority communities. For 40 years, the families of St. Louis had no way to connect what was happening to them to what the Army had done over their homes. They didn't know the tests had occurred. They couldn't ask their doctors about zinc cadmium sulfide exposure. They couldn't file claims. They couldn't demand studies. They were, in the most literal sense, kept in the dark about a health variable that may have affected their bodies for the rest of their lives. When the operations were finally declassified and acknowledged in the early 1990s, health researchers began attempting to reconstruct what, if anything, could be learned from available records. What they found was a system that had, through a combination of neglect and circumstance, made it nearly impossible to conduct a definitive retrospective study. The National Research Council reviewed the available evidence in 1997 and concluded that while acute health effects from the spray operations could not be ruled out, the long-term health data necessary to draw firm conclusions about cancer rates and chronic respiratory disease in the affected population simply did not exist in analyzable form. Read that carefully. The data does not exist. Not because the effects didn't happen, but because no one tracked them. No one tracked them because for 40 years no one in those communities was allowed to know they had been exposed to anything. Doris Spates was a resident of Pruitt-Ego during the spray period. She was an infant in 1953. Her father died of a rare cancer when she was young. 3 of her siblings also died of cancer. In interviews conducted after the declassification, Spates stated that she had always believed something was wrong in her neighborhood, that the rates of illness she witnessed growing up were not normal, but that she had no framework to understand why until she read the Army's own documents. The Army's position has consistently been that the zinc cadmium sulfide used in Operation LAC did not cause the health outcomes that residents describe. They point to the 1997 NRC report's inability to establish a definitive causal link. But critics of that position note that the NRC's inability to establish the link is itself a product of the 40-year information blackout that prevented any systematic tracking of health outcomes in the first place. You cannot prove harm you were never allowed to document. What makes Operation LAC even more disturbing, when you understand its full context, is that it was not an isolated experiment. It was one component of a sprawling classified biological and chemical weapons testing program that the Army conducted across the United States for decades. From 1949 through at least 1969, the Army's Special Operations Division and the Chemical Corps conducted open-air testing of biological and chemical simulants, and in some cases, actual biological agents over American cities, coastlines, and transportation systems. Operation Sea Spray in 1950 released Serratia marcescens bacteria over the San Francisco Bay Area from a Navy vessel. Within days, 11 patients at Stanford University Hospital were admitted with rare Serratia infections. One man, Edward Nevin, died. The Army denied responsibility for decades. The connection was established in a 1977 Senate hearing. A United States citizen died as a direct result of a secret government biological test conducted on an American civilian population without consent, without notification, and without any mechanism for legal accountability. In 1966, the Army released Bacillus subtilis variant Niger, a bacteria considered at the time to be a harmless simulant, through the New York City subway system. Operatives dropped light bulbs filled with the bacteria onto the tracks, where they shattered and released the organisms into the ventilation systems that then spread them throughout the tunnel network and into the air of every station they serviced. An estimated 1 million New York subway riders were exposed in a single day. The Army's test report described the results as successful and noted that the dispersal patterns confirmed that a biological weapon released in the subway system could infect large numbers of people quickly and efficiently. What the Army's 1966 report did not include in its assessment was any follow-up on the health of those 1 million exposed people, because they were not told, because there was no follow-up mechanism, because the people in the New York City subway in 1966 were simply data points in a government test, not human beings with rights. The story of how Operation LAC came to light is itself a story about the limits of government transparency. The program was not exposed by a whistleblower. It was not uncovered by investigative journalism. It emerged slowly, imperfectly, and incompletely through the machinery of declassification driven by congressional pressure in the early 1990s. In 1993, the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee released a report documenting that the Department of Defense had conducted hundreds of classified tests on American civilians and military personnel dating back to the 1940s. The report identified at least 239 populated areas where chemical or biological agents had been released. 239 populated areas. The report triggered a series of declassification orders that began releasing the underlying documents, including the Operation LAC files. What those files showed, when researchers like Martino Taylor finally obtained and analyzed them, went beyond what even the Senate report had suggested. The targeting criteria documents are particularly revealing. They describe test zones in terms of their population vulnerability characteristics, a phrase that appears repeatedly in the planning files and which, in context, refers to the likelihood that a test population would become aware of the testing and create a public relations problem for the Army. Low-income black neighborhoods scored well on population vulnerability characteristics because they lacked political representation, had limited media access, and were, in the Army's internal assessment, unlikely to generate the kind of organized public response that could compromise operational security. This is documented. This is in the Army's own files. The government did not just accidentally expose poor black communities to toxic chemical particles. They chose those communities because they calculated that those communities were least likely to be able to fight back. While the Army was conducting spray operations over St. Louis, it maintained a carefully constructed cover story for any local officials or residents who happened to notice the unusual activity. The official explanation, distributed to city and county officials who made inquiries, was that the Army was conducting smokescreen research related to protecting cities from enemy observation. This explanation was partially true in the most technically misleading sense possible. The Army was studying how particles dispersed over cities. The fact that they were specifically studying biological weapons delivery dispersal patterns was omitted from every communication with civilian authorities. St. Louis city officials accepted the explanation. They had no reason not to. This was the height of the Cold War. The Army was conducting national security research. Cooperation felt like patriotism. What those city officials did not know was that the smokescreen research involved releasing a compound containing cadmium over some of the most densely populated residential blocks in their city, blocks where their own constituents' children were playing. The cover story held completely for 4 decades. It held because the Army classified everything. It held because the officials who had been briefed were bound by security clearances. It held because the communities targeted had no access to the information infrastructure that might have allowed them to ask the right questions. The cover story did not break. The documents broke free. Let's be precise about what the fully assembled documentary record shows. Because the Army and the Department of Defense have spent 30 years managing the public narrative around Operation LAC with careful language and selective emphasis. The documents confirm 4 things that are not disputed. First, the Army deliberately released zinc cadmium sulfide, a compound containing cadmium, over densely populated residential areas of St. Louis, Minnesota, and Canada without the knowledge or consent of the civilians exposed. Second, the Army's own pre-operation safety assessments flagged concerns about cadmium inhalation risks, and those concerns were noted and then overridden in the decision to proceed. Third, the targeting criteria used to select test zones identified characteristics: population density, low political influence, minimal media access, that in application resulted in the overwhelming selection of low-income black neighborhoods. Fourth, no health monitoring was conducted, no follow-up study was performed, no notification was provided to exposed residents at any point during or after the testing period. The communities that were used as test subjects were given no opportunity to understand what had been done to their bodies. These 4 facts, taken together, describe something that in any other context would be recognized immediately for what it is. A government institution identified a vulnerable population, exposed them to a potentially harmful substance without their consent, knew the risks, suppressed the information, and ensured that the people harmed could never prove it. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947 in direct response to Nazi medical experimentation on concentration camp prisoners, requires that voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Operation LAC began 6 years after the Nuremberg Code was established. The Army conducted it anyway. Pruitt Ego was demolished between 1972 and 1976. The towers came down one by one in controlled explosions that sent enormous clouds of pulverized building material, including whatever residue from 28 spray operations might have settled into the concrete and insulation over the previous 2 decades, into the air one final time. The people who had lived there scattered. They went to other neighborhoods in St. Louis, to other cities, to relatives' homes. They carried their health histories with them, but not the documentation that might have explained those histories, because that documentation was still classified. For the former residents who came forward after the 1994 congressional hearings, the experience of learning what had been done to them was described consistently in terms of a specific kind of violation, not just the harm itself, but the helplessness of having been used without knowledge and the impossibility of fully understanding the consequences because the baseline data was never collected. That question, how do you get justice for something they made sure you could never prove, is the question that sits at the center of this story and has never been adequately answered. The Army has never offered financial compensation to the residents of the Operation LAC test zones. No settlement was reached. No individual accountability was established. The officials who ordered the tests were protected by the classification system, by the passage of time, and by the sovereign immunity doctrines that make suing the federal government for this category of harm extraordinarily difficult. The government's formal position today remains that zinc cadmium sulfide at the concentrations used in Operation LAC did not cause demonstrable harm, and that the 1997 NRC report supports this conclusion. What that position does not address is the circularity of that conclusion. The concentration data from the tests was never collected at the level of individual human exposure. There is no data on how much ZNCDS any individual resident inhaled because no one was monitoring that. The Army is citing the absence of evidence that they themselves prevented from being gathered. The thumbnail that brought you to this video made a specific promise. It showed you a declassified government document. It showed you the word St. Louis and low-income residential zones. It told you they were tested on. Every element of that promise is real. The document is real. The redactions are real. The words are in the file, and the story behind them is documented in the Army's own records, confirmed in congressional hearings, analyzed by independent researchers, and acknowledged, in the careful, limited language of institutional self-protection, by the Department of Defense itself. The people of Pruitt-Igoe were tested on. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented historical fact confirmed by the government that did it. And here is the final revelation that the documents contain. The one detail that, even after everything else in this story, still has the power to stop you cold. In the Army's own post-operation assessment of the St. Louis spray program, filed in 1954 and declassified 4 decades later, the Chemical Corps evaluating officer wrote that the St. Louis operations had produced exceptionally useful data on large-scale biological agent dispersal over high-density residential environments and recommended the methodology for future testing operations in comparable urban zones. Future testing operations in comparable urban zones. They considered it a success. They used it as a model, and they did it again. The question of what happened to the residents of the Operation LAC test zones is not just a historical question. It is a question about the mechanisms that allow governments to make decisions about whose bodies are acceptable risks and whose are not. In 2018, environmental health researchers sampling soil in former spray zones in North St. Louis detected cadmium concentrations above baseline levels consistent with decades-old surface deposition. The test zones still carry the chemical signature of what was done there 70 years ago. The ground remembers even when the government would prefer that everyone forget. The communities affected by Operation LAC and programs like it have consistently been denied the 2 things that would allow full accountability: comprehensive health data collected during the exposure period, and legal mechanisms for seeking compensation that don't require proof the government made impossible to gather. The 1994 congressional hearings produced testimony. The 1997 NRC report produced a review. The declassification orders produced documents, but none of it produced justice for the families who breathed those particles, who buried their relatives, and who spent decades wondering why illness seemed to follow them with such persistence. Doris Spates, who was an infant in Pruitt-Igoe in 1953 when the spray operations began, was still alive when this story gained renewed attention in 2012 following the publication of Martino Taylor's research. She testified. She told her family's story. She connected the deaths she had witnessed to the documents she had finally been allowed to read. Knowing doesn't mean they're sorry. The United States Army conducted 28 spray operations over low-income black neighborhoods in St. Louis between 1953 and 1954. The Army's own documents show they chose those neighborhoods deliberately. The Army's own safety assessments flagged the risks of what they were releasing. The Army's own post-operation report called it a success and recommended it as a model. The documents are real, the people were real, and the choice to use them. without their knowledge, without their consent, and without any mechanism for accountability, was made deliberately by people who calculated that these particular human beings were an acceptable cost. That calculation is the darkest thing in these files, not the chemistry, not the dispersal data, not the cover story. The calculation itself, the moment when someone looked at a map, looked at the demographics, and decided that the people in those blocks could be used without asking, that is the document that matters most. And it is the one they can never fully redact, because it is written in everything that surrounds it. The next video in this series covers a program that makes Operation LAC look like a preliminary test, because that is exactly what the Army called it. Operation Whitecoat, Operation Big Itch, Project 112, the framework that turned American cities into laboratories, ran for 20 years, touched hundreds of communities, and the full scope of what was done has still never been completely declassified. That file is still being opened. Everything you watch tonight came from documents that existed for 40 years before anyone outside the government was allowed to read them. The only question worth sitting with is this: what is classified right now that the next generation will watch a video about in 40 years, wondering how it was ever allowed to happen?